Hello and welcome to the By Dean podcast, a twice-monthly podcast dedicated to discussing various aspects of the queer coding of Dean Winchester from the show Supernatural. Today we will be discussing an always heated and controversial topic, queerbaiting. We will explore questions such as what is queerbaiting and whether or not that term applies to Dean or to his relationship with other male characters on the show, such as, Castiel. My name is Rachel, and I am the podcast host/coordinator. And I have several handles on Tumblr, but the one people tend to know me best by is Arguments Against By Dean Are Bad. And I have three guests with me today, three brand new guests, and I'm really, really excited to talk to them today. So I'm going to hand it over to them to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Tink. My Tumblr handle is TinkDW. And I am one of the relatively new sort of meta writers. I've been around on Tumblr for a year now, so that's me.
Hi, I'm Sarah, or Saz, and my Tumblr handle is BlueStar86, and I've been around for probably about 2 years now. So, and again, in the meta writing community on Tumblr.
I'm Emily, or Laughing at Fate on Tumblr. I think I've been around for about 2 years now, but mostly just lurking.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today. So those are my three guests, and I'm really, really excited to talk to them. So before we get into the question of whether or not Dean specifically has been sort of queerbaited on Supernatural, I think it's a good idea to have a bit of a pre-discussion about what do we think queerbaiting is. You know, there's a lot of ideas and there's a lot of very malleable definitions that kind of run around fandom. And so I'm just curious to get other people's, I have an idea about what I think it is, but I am curious to get other people's kind of opinions about what they think queerbaiting is or how they would define it, sort of before we get into the nitty gritty about Dean. So does anyone want to bravely start off with what they think it is?
Well, for me, queerbaiting is the concept that you are going to portray a character in a queer way. You're going to hint that they might be queer, but then you don't actually ever follow through. That would be, for me, the main definition, is that you don't follow through on it in the end.
Yeah, and in my experience, that has always been the sort of most general, most sort of common definition that I've encountered. I have seen people use it in other ways, but that does tend to be the most stereotypical definition that I have encountered. Does anyone have any kind of definition that deviates from that in any way?
Not really. I'd say that I pretty much agree with that. I don't know whether it can perhaps differ depending on like historical content as well, based on compared like what we see today regarding what we would consider queerbaiting today, based on say 20, 30 years ago. Because one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is about the way that in British cinema specifically, there was a lot of, I don't think that they would have considered it queerbaiting back then to have to use the idea of queer subtext in a comedy value as a comedy method in shows such as Monty Python, Carry On films, things like that. They tended to use that sort of like gay is funny when it's not actually gay. So I don't think back then they would have considered that queerbaiting, but now it certainly would be. So. And that's something I have been thinking about recently in terms of certain British ships that potentially haven't gone canon or haven't, and of course controversy in recent years. But that's more of a British cultural thing rather than a general idea.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And I think that actually bringing up a historical framework for thinking about this is actually really useful and important, because I do think the concept of queerbaiting is historically grounded in the sense that for a long time there wasn't the sensibility, because queerbaiting kind of assumes that there is a built-in audience that sort of wants to see queer representation, or a kind of substantial set of the audience that wants to see queer representation, and that there is, something to be gained from that. Whereas historically, I don't know that there was the broad sensibility that people really wanted, like on any kind of broad scale, wanted to see queer characters. And so, yes, those kind of subtextual or, how subtextual they were can vary widely. But like those implications of queerness historically weren't always sort of designed to draw in people who they thought, might want to see this. It was more kind of a thing to be laughed at. And so even though it does have queer implications, it wouldn't necessarily be useful to call it queer baiting because, again, queer baiting has that, at least as far as I understand it, it's specifically designed to speak to people who genuinely want to see queer representation. And like, that isn't a dynamic that makes sense. I mean, I'm sure there were people who 50 years ago or whatever, wanted to see that, of course. But there wasn't the sense that there was a broad audience for that might have wanted that. And so, I think the term queer baiting definitely requires a historical setting and a historical framing to kind of make sense, at least in the way that I understand it.
I agree. And one of the things that I think is relevant in this discussion as well, historically, is that obviously in the past, there was no likelihood that it ever would have been canon. There was no likelihood that they would have depicted a queer protagonist and their partner on screen in Hollywood in the 1920s. So when we see the homoerotic subtext in that time, we know that really they're doing it for layering and they're doing it for various reasons, but it was never likely to actually follow through. Whereas when we're talking in the context of now, it's much more, actually, is this something that it is going to be followed through on? And is it narratively something that is going to be relevant to the show or to the movie and not just for the subtext and for the layering? And I think that's two different things as well. The likelihood of it actually happening does have an impact.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you're spot on that part of how queer baiting works is that there has to be some sensibility that this would be a possible kind of trajectory. And you're right that 50 or 80 or whatever, how many years ago, like there was no sense that would have even been possible. So there wouldn't have been no expectations of follow through to kind of play upon, right? Just want to sort of throw this out there. Were there other aspects of queer baiting that we haven't definitional kind of concepts that we haven't touched on that people sort of want to add in or think through more extensively?
Perhaps creator intent. I think that's probably a big part of it. Whether they're using that homoerotic subtext to actually draw in a queer audience, and if that is their intention to, I think that's when queer baiting is at its most. That's where the definition kind of comes from, is that the creators are putting in the subtext, they're putting in those homoerotic layers to draw in a queer audience because they want to gain a wider audience with no intention to follow through on that or to give a queer audience what they want at all, which is why I consider it more of a modern concept. I don't think it will be relevant historically. Because I don't think that any creators 30, 40, 50 years ago would have even considered a queer audience as someone to capture. I don't think it would have been their initial thought. I think there would have been other reasons for it, as I said, cultural reasons, comedy reasons. I don't think it would have been relevant otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, like, a lot of people in fandom are queer, but the visibility of Slash, and particularly the kind of intense fandom activity that can develop, particularly around Slash pairings, that's only come into consciousness in Hollywood somewhat recently. Exactly. Slash fans have existed at least since the early 1970s, but, people in Hollywood were not broadly aware of Slash probably until the early 2000s, I would say, like on any kind of broad scale.
Yes, I agree with you. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm not trying to say that it didn't exist. It's more in terms of what the creators in the likes of Hollywood or in the British film industry, they wouldn't have considered it back then. It wouldn't have crossed their minds at the time. I think it's something that they're aware of now, and in modern shows they're using it, and it is queer baiting in modern shows, but not in shows from like 50 years ago.
Right. No, I completely agree. So, I mean, partially it's queer audiences and also fandom audiences many of whom are queer, or much of whom are queer, but not sort of universally. I mean, there's plenty of Slash fans who are heterosexual, but who also would be part of that like audience that that creators in Hollywood or in, British filmmakers or other entertainment industry people would want to sort of cater to, at least to a certain degree, which is where the impetus for queerbaiting potentially at least comes from, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're all fairly kind of on the same page in terms of what queerbaiting is, it sounds like. So I'm curious, let me just put this question very, very kind of simply out there, and we can discuss the sort of why later. But do we think Dean Winchester, as of, let's say as of today, just as of today, can we say that Dean Winchester's queerness or bisexuality has been queerbaited?
In the later seasons, or in general over the entirety of the show, or as of today, right now in the show?
As of today, right now, assuming we take the series as a kind of holistic text as it exists right now, can we sort of say that Dean has been queerbaited?
My opinion is very strongly in the no camp. This is because I come at it from the narrative point of view, and for me, the narrative is that the story hasn't ended yet. And from my point of view, there are many, many aspects of the story. And for me, the story overall is a story which has a starting point and it has an end point, which is subverting the pilot, is subverting the beginning of the show. And a huge part of that is a lot of those aspects of Dean that we know, the performing Dean, the soft Dean, all of those things. And his sexuality is just one of those components. And so for me, the whole story of Dean is building on all of these things, and all of these things are on the road to being subverted. I think and I hope that in the end they all will be, and his sexuality will be one of those aspects. And so I personally don't see that it is queerbaiting unless the show ends and he is not then shown and portrayed as queer. And my reading of the story as a whole, like I say, narratively, is that this is something that will be addressed at the end of the show, just because that's how I read the story and the way that it's been constructed. And like I say, his sexuality is just one of those components. But I'm coming at this from the point of view of a heterosexual woman who is really into stories, and I really enjoy the story part of it. So I'm not necessarily looking for representation. I can utterly understand people who really want representation and really want it in the show and really want it from Dean. I absolutely am on board with that, and I definitely do think that it is queerbaiting if it doesn't happen. But for me, as it stands at this point in the story, I don't see it that way.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I've heard a lot of people sort of have a lot of contentious debates about whether or not you can fairly call something queerbaiting if the show hasn't ended yet, if there's still that sort of open possibility. And I can sort of see both sides in the sense that I agree that you probably can't make any kind of final declaration about it until the show is over. You never know for sure. But I have also heard people argue that letting the show run out to the very, very end and being like, well, we don't know, also just enables, because, the whole point of queerbaiting is that it's designed to be sort of manipulative in the sense that, it's trying to get you to come back to continue watching the show, right? And so that, wait until the very end is part of what enables that manipulation, because if you're like, well, I don't know if it's going to happen, then it allows that endless kind of open possibility to kind of continue to draw you back in.
I do agree with Tink in how she's explained how it is a wait until the end kind of thing, until I start screaming, this has been queerbait and they've been manipulating us. I would never say that about the show until the end, but because I generally think of queerbaiting as something that is based on the intentions of the creators at the time, so I would divide the show up into showrunners, and the way that I analyse the show, I would consider, for instance, in the later seasons, I do not think that Dab is queerbaiting us, and I did not think that Carver was queerbaiting us. Sarah Gamble, I would say yes. I don't think there was any intention at that point in time. If the show had ended at that point in time, there was no intention. There was no it was more so. Again, when I try to compare it to the likes of British comedy from the 1970s and things like the Carry On films and Monty Python, where the gay subtext was used as a bit of a laugh and a joke. That's where you have like Destiel and YD in seasons 6 and 7. They use those same sort of jokes. It was made into a humorous thing, and whilst there were nods to it, it was never, you could tell that there wasn't, in my mind, the only exception would have been 620, which was Edlund trying to save season 6. But again, when I look at seasons 1 to 5, I don't necessarily consider that queerbaiting either, because I think Kripke has said as well that he's interested in homoeroticism in the background, but I don't know. I suppose with Kripke, I'm a bit on the fence. So in the first 5 seasons, I'm kind of on the fence. 6 and 7, I would say yes. At that period of time, I do think it was queerbaiting.
I agree.
And then season 8 onwards, I do not think it's queerbaiting. I think this is a love story that has been embedded in the narrative structure that is being built on, and Dean's sexuality is a part of that. And you can see this when you look at meta writers describing performing Dean and his ability to sublimate and all of these things that kind of come along with his character development. It's no longer just a gag. It's not for laughs anymore. This is serious character stuff, and that isn't queerbaiting.
Yeah, I agree, because I do feel that Kripke potentially was never going to follow through on the subtext. I do kind of get the impression that he probably didn't necessarily think that it was going to go anywhere, but hey, we don't know for sure. And I agree that Sarah Gamble was queerbaiting from what we understand, if Cass was supposed to just die in season 7, because I don't think that there was another male role who was necessarily going to take up that mantle for Dean's story. So I do agree that in those earlier seasons, it could definitely be seen as queerbaiting. We don't know, because we don't know how it would have ended at that time, but I think it's highly likely. And I do completely agree that since then, though, they have been building a lot of this even more by Dean subtext. We have been building even more the Destiel subtext, and it definitely seems like it's much more of an endgame story now, rather than just the subtext.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what's been said so far, in that I think it's too early to say for sure. But I also wanted to add that I understand that letting it run out to the end could enable them to queerbait, but I also feel like it's important to emphasize the fact that characters don't have to be queer from the very moment they arrive on the show. I think it could actually be good to have characters come out later on and give more diversity to stories. Like, if they're not just a queer character from the beginning, especially since a lot of people don't come out when they're young. Like, they come out later in life. They may not even know until later in life.
Yeah, and I actually, that's super interesting that you say that, because we're actually planning to have a whole show on the kind of the issue of making characters queer later in a story, and also coming out later in life, and why it's important to sort of portray that. And that's kind of actually, that's probably one of the most positive ways of seeing this, I think, is that, yeah, that actually in some ways waiting until later on. I mean, there are some people who say he's been coded as queer from the very beginning, and I can get on board with that argument to a degree, but he certainly hasn't been explicitly canonically bisexual since the beginning. Like, I don't know that anyone could sort of argue that. And the idea that, like, the show is still running, and Dean is getting older, and, like, we almost never see, we've discussed this a little bit on the podcast before, is that you almost never see on television or in mainstream media people coming out sort of later on in life. It happens occasionally, but it's not super common. And that actually, like, waiting towards the latter part of the series adds something of value to sort of letting that kind of progress, and letting Dean come out as essentially, assuming that it happens, as approaching middle-aged kind of man, because that's a pretty unusual story to tell, and one that also could potentially have a lot of unique kind of value in our current cultural landscape.
I totally agree. And one of the interesting things as well is not just for the age sort of referencing, which I think is absolutely a really interesting factor, but in terms of the narrative of the show, every other queer character that we've had on the show and that we generally see in the media, they tell us straight from the off that they're queer. You know, we had Charlie, we had the Hunter husbands, we've had Max. The first episode we see them in, immediately we're told that they're queer. It's like as if it's something that defines them, and that is something that really bothers me, because your sexuality is a part of you, but it is not... I don't go up to someone and the first time that I meet them I say, hey, by the way, I'm heterosexual. You know, it's just not one of those things that automatically is one of the first things you say about yourself. And for me, one of the really important aspects of By Dean is the fact that it does not change who he is. It really doesn't change anything. He's still going to be Dean. He's still going to be loving pie, even if he likes cake too. He's still, you know, all those aspects of him. He's still going to love his baby. He's still going to tease his brother about his hair. Like, he's still the same guy. So the fact that you don't find out that he's queer until season 13 or season 14 or whenever it is not really a big deal. You know, it doesn't have to be something that you are told in the pilot.
Yeah, and I mean, we're probably going to do a whole episode on the kind of the issue of having a character explicitly come out later in the series, and like why people, because a lot of people are sort of resistant to that idea, and exploring the reasons why people are resistant to that idea. I think a lot of the reasons for it are incredibly bad, personally, but there is that sort of resistance. And a lot of the quote-unquote anti-arguments that you see is, this idea that it's somehow fundamentally going to change his character or change the story or, you know, create this radical shift from what Supernatural was before, which I think is, as you say, really kind of a silly paranoia. Like, I don't think anybody wants it to become, like, there's plenty of things wrong with Glee, but it definitely, its level of queer representation is not something to be, like, is not bad. But, like, Supernatural isn't ever going to be that. It's still going to be Supernatural, even if Dean is explicitly bisexual. This idea that once you are queer, in sort of fiction, that sort of becomes your only identifying trait, and that it becomes the kind of essence and the whole thing that your character kind of revolves around. You know, I understand why people wouldn't want that for Dean, because it's a really reductive way to write a character, but Dean can still be Dean and be bisexual. And in fact, like, a lot of people would argue that he kind of already is, and that kind of demonstrates that obviously he can still be himself, and have queerness be a part of him, but not absorbing his whole existence, which seems to be the fear. So I want to return to actually something that someone brought up. I'm sorry, I don't remember who exactly it was. But the question of actually, because I tend to, and perhaps this isn't a useful way to think about Supernatural, particularly in terms of queerbaiting, because it kind of is related to authorial intent to a certain degree. But like, I tend to think of Supernatural as a holistic kind of text, even though, as multiple people pointed out, there have been multiple people, showrunners, and even more sort of people who are just staff writers on Supernatural. And it is entirely possible for those people who write the show to have alternate kind of intentions from one another in terms of how they write all kinds of things, but also the idea of scripting Dean's bisexuality into the show. So it's interesting to think about the kind of breaking it up by the sort of Kripke era, the Gimbel era, the Carver era, you know, that kind of stuff, and thinking about, does the question of queerbaiting, can it even, because obviously, you know, Supernatural is somewhat a coherent text, even though it has had multiple people writing it and producing it in different, over a long period of time. Does it even make sense to think about it holistically, or do you think you have to only think about it in terms of, like, who is executive producing the show now, or who is running the show now, and only ask the queerbaiting question with regard to that? Because obviously, when we think about what's happening in the text, Dean's queerness spans the entire series. And a lot of people would argue that queerbaiting is also a thing that exists sort of holistically in a text. You know, it's all these little implications that build up over time. So is it fair to sort of hold later producers or later showrunners to the implications of earlier showrunners. Because Supernatural is sort of unique in how many showrunners it has had, and like they're sort of taking this over, even though they weren't necessarily in charge when some of the queerness was being kind of hinted at. So I'm just curious to get people's thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was me that mentioned about breaking it up into its various showrunners, and I think I would say that whilst you do want to look at it as a whole, because the characters, obviously their journeys have developed and progressed across the entire show, so you can still look at Dean in season 1 and compare him to Dean in season 12 and say, these are where he has differed. This is, this is the journey he's gone through. But ultimately, there is still these aspects of bisexuality. You can see the bisexuality in both of those characters in both season 1 and season 12. Perhaps season 12 was a little bit more obvious in terms of the way it's built into the story, but it is still definitely there in both. I think that it's probably just the way that I do it because it makes it easier for me to analyse the story. Because Supernatural is one of those rare shows where each showrunner would have had their own idea of where they wanted to take that story, the structure they were going to build, whether or not they had intended to have a love story in it, or and what points they wanted to get to during their career as showrunner. I think that it's quite clear, and not just with Dean's bisexuality, but with other aspects of the show as well, that you can tell the changeovers. I think even if you were someone who was coming into Supernatural new and you didn't know when the showrunners were changing, you can tell. I think that it's quite easy to tell when the differences are, that seasons 1 to 5 particularly, they are a contained story. And I think that's why you get so many people who would say that Supernatural ended in season 5 and they haven't watched it since because they don't consider the later seasons to be part or connected to that original story. So I do think that perhaps that you can't really hold each showrunner to the mistakes of their predecessors. That's why I say, for instance, I am of the camp that when Sarah Gamble was showrunner, I do think it was queerbaiting, and I do think that the intentions at the time were nothing more than to poke fun at the ship, to poke fun at Dean's subtextual bisexuality. I don't think, because I would compare it to shows like Sherlock in the UK and compare the way that they queerbaited compared to the way Supernatural was in season 6 and 7. And I would say Supernatural in season 6 and 7 was rife with queerbaiting. I don't think that seasons 8 onwards have been at all. I don't see the same kind of hints and jokes and moments of, for an example, like the way that, Meg would be like, oh, he's your boyfriend first. That's such a classic, oh, they're boyfriends, haha, that's so funny. They haven't really used that in the later seasons, and when they have used it, it's in one deleted scene. It wasn't used in the same, it wasn't made to be a joke, it was made to sort of call out Crowley on his feelings. And so again, it's the tone. I think you have to analyse the tone of it in the text, and I think when it's queerbaiting, the tone is humorous. Isn't this funny? They could be gay, ha ha, it's quite immature. And when you are adding it in as a serious analytical point, it's not queerbaiting. So that's why I have to split it up by showrunner.
I do the same. I split it up by writer and showrunner as well. So previously I would have said that I believe that, for example, Dab, Berens, potentially Edlund, they hint at Destiel especially, but then we have writers who also hint at by Dean. And I would say that if their authorial intent is never to follow through, then that would be queerbaiting. Now that Dab is the showrunner, those themes have really, well, they've built so much in the last season. So my perception is that he's building towards something, which makes me think that he's building on what he's already written in the past. Now, if he became showrunner and Destiel and by Dean weren't building, then I would say that what he did before was queerbaiting, for example.
Yeah, that's that. I mean, it's an interesting way to look at it, because you can say, how much control over the writers does the showrunner have? And if Dab at that period of time during season 6 and 7, he was adding in these themes, same with Edmund, but never intended to take them anywhere because he didn't think that they were going anywhere, then yes, I suppose you could say that even he at the time was queerbaiting.
Yeah, if he wrote Bloodlines knowing that it wasn't going to happen, then I would consider that queerbaiting. But because it's during Carver era, which I consider had a possibility of actually following through, I don't necessarily see it as queerbaiting. It depends on whether they think that it's likely to happen or not when they write it, I think.
This brings up something that sort of makes it, for me, very, very difficult to, like, one of the things that I've been sort of struggling with thinking about, really in a sort of pan-fandom sense, like across fandoms, is the issue of, like, the fact that shows are written, like the production of shows, there is no, like, in most cases, there is no, like, one or two people. Like, Sherlock is a unique case because it has very, very little show content overall, and it was written entirely by the same small group of people who had very, very strong control over everything that happened. And so, like, you can concisely sort of assign intentionality to a distinct group of people. But with something like Supernatural, which has had, again, 4 showrunners and dozens of staff writers across its entire sort of production, and it is entirely possible for people who work on the production of Supernatural at various levels to have intentions that are divergent from each other or even at odds with each other. And so the accusation of queerbaiting becomes really, really complicated because it's like, well, you know, if Ben Edlund really, really genuinely sort of saw Dean as bisexual and believed that Dean and Castiel were, you know, romantically intended, then arguably the things he wrote weren't queerbaiting in and of themselves, but also if later showrunners don't follow through, that it isn't necessarily their fault that he wrote the particular things that he wrote or whatever. And so it becomes this really, really, really complex kind of issue of, like, who do you assign blame to, for lack of a better word, if, like, the production of the text is so, like, diffuse and so spread out, and the fact that multiple people can have sort of multiple intentions for a text that may not coalesce with one another's. Like, can the concept of queerbaiting even make sense in that context, do we think?
I think it can when you can see, for example, as we stand right now, things have really built, and they've built and built and built over 12 years, and the Destiel subtext specifically, but obviously we have seen the Bideen subtext come up massively as well, especially since season 8 onwards. And the thing is that as of now, the showrunners and the writers are well aware that Supernatural is the first thing that comes up when you type queerbaiting into Google. They know that they are known potentially for queerbaiting. So the fact that this season especially has built on it so exponentially and gone through the roof with that kind of subtext, that's part of why we think that is part of the endgame for sure now, or it is part of Dab's vision for endgame anyway. Who knows what might happen if he leaves and someone else takes charge. It could go completely in the opposite direction, but it appears that is his vision. Now, if that isn't his vision, and at this time they are building on it and they're going exponentially through the roof with it, then that is definitely queerbaiting, because they really have to know exactly what they're doing at this point in time based on the fact that everyone knows what they've been doing before that, and they've made it worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that way of approaching it, I think, makes sense, and I think it's kind of the cleanest and the easiest way to think about it. But it's also interesting to return to something that someone said earlier. I'm interested in the idea that the seriousness of the kind of implication of queerness it lessens the kind of queerbaiting aspect of it to a degree, because that's actually an argument that I've not encountered before. And I'm curious because I can think of, like, I don't necessarily hold this view, but I can think of certain meta writers and certain people in fandom I've heard discuss this issue. And many of them say that the sort of seriousness of it is even, I mean, obviously we don't know whether it's actually going to be canonized or not. And so we are sort of talking in hypotheticals, but that the seriousness or the earnestness of the sort of queer implication that's happening sort of in the later seasons is actually more queerbaity, precisely because it reads as earnest. It reads as sincere. And so I'm just curious, like, your perception or anyone else's kind of thoughts on that idea that, like, the jokey kind of implications are actually less queerbaity to people because they're portrayed as jokes. And that these kind of, like, very serious scenes, like, you know, when Cass, like, for example, Stuck in the Middle with You, you know, Cass is dying and he seems to be confessing love to Dean. You know, it's not explicitly romantic love, but it's kind of like, it's very strongly hinting at that, like that actually that is more queerbaity in some ways.
I would definitely agree with that. I don't think joking is the only kind of queerbaiting, and I think that the earnestness of it actually would increase the queerbaiting because, as we said before, the whole point of queerbaiting is to bait an audience into believing something will happen. And I think the earnestness and seriousness of it definitely makes it seem like it is going to happen more. So if they do make it earnest and then don't follow through, I think that would be increasing the queerbaiting.
No, I do agree with that. I think what I was trying to get across is that queerbaiting, when you see it, certainly, and again, I'd use something like Sherlock as an example, when it has been, I think it's more obvious when it's this jokey, humorous, haha, you know, they're gay, it's funny. I think that is generally it's a harmful thing to do in today's, you know, in modern days. I think that it was queerbaiting at that time because there wasn't any seriousness behind it, and it was. That's why I think that at that period of time it was queerbaiting. I certainly agree with the fact that if they don't follow through with it, having done what they've done now, where they've built it into the story, where they've made it serious, where it is genuinely, as me and Tink have often discussed, this love story that they have now built with Dean and Cass, specifically in the later seasons. Sometimes, certainly in season 11 and 12, half the time the plot doesn't even make sense without the Destiel reading. So you get people saying what's going on. If they don't understand it, if they don't see the Destiel reading, sometimes it makes the story seem somewhat confusing. If the story ended at this point in time and they never brought that textually into, you know, and they never brought it out, they never actually brought Dean out of the closet and made Destiel into a real thing, then yes, it would be queerbaiting, and it would be far, far worse than any jokey type of queerbaiting like the kind that you get in Sherlock, like the kind that you get in seasons 6 and 7. It would be far, far worse and far more harmful. But my argument is that I don't see it as queerbaiting at the moment because I guess I have faith in the showrunners not to be that much of a jackass. I don't want to think that Dab is doing all of this to bait us because it's so harmful and because it would be such an awful, awful thing to do. They have passed the point of no return. And if they don't go there, it would be a travesty. Yeah, like I said, if it had ended after season 7 and it was still that jokey, humorous side of it, I think they could have still maybe got away with it. It would have been queerbaiting, but you look at it and you compare it to other shows that do the same kind of thing and you say, yes, it's that whole homoerotic, you know, it's all for laughs, it's all for a joke, it's, oh yeah, you're gay, you know, it makes the heterosexual male audience laugh because they find it funny. I have a brother, he thinks, you know, gay is funny. And it's a horrible, horrible mentality, but it is a straight male mentality a lot of the time. They might have been able to get away with it at the end of season 7, but at this point where it's become this very, very serious love story in the scripts, they can't get away with it anymore, which is why I cannot contemplate the idea that they are queerbaiting us now. I hate it. It is far worse than queerbaiting. I think it would be an absolute travesty.
That's really helpful just in terms of understanding kind of, yeah, because I was a little bit kind of put off by that idea, but now I understand the way that you're sort of framing it. I wasn't quite following before, but I follow now.
Yeah, sorry if I didn't make that clear.
I think
no problem.
The problem at this point in time, and as Sarah says, and I'm just going to expand really quickly, my point of view is that, same as Sarah, not only at this point in time would it be queerbaiting if they don't follow through on by Dean, because it's a huge part of all the things that they're trying to subvert from his original characterization and a part of his character development, but also Destiel, as she said, it's part of the story now. Season 11 makes no sense without Destiel. So it would not just be queerbaiting, it would also be story baiting. It would be the worst kind of storytelling. The writers Other writers would be laughing at them. Dad would be laughed out of the room at whatever interview he went to try and get another job, because people would look at what he's done in showrunning, people would look at what the other writers have been doing and the story that they've been telling, and they'd say, this makes no sense. Where were you trying to go with this? The plot doesn't hold up. So it's not just queer baiting at this point, it is also story baiting, which it makes no sense. Why would they do that? Why would they destroy their own plot line?
I mean, I'm one of those people that's actually extremely on the fence as to whether I think this is going to happen or not. Like, I absolutely see the sort of setups for it. I see the kind of the patterning for it. And I actually do agree to a large extent that if it ends without that, it's kind of like it doesn't really make sense. I agree. But I am also kind of that opinion that I don't know that at this point, especially because the show is so long running at this point, that I don't know that it's going to matter to anyone outside of this kind of circle of people who are highly, highly invested in Supernatural and highly, highly invested in its trajectory, that people are going to care how it ends. Again, outside of the circle of people to whom we belong to, that are massively invested in this, which is why I am kind of ambivalent about whether or not I think they're actually going to follow through. Because, I mean, I think Supernatural in the past has gotten away with doing things that don't make a lot of sense, and have sort of just dropped things that in a way that was not good storytelling. And so while I want to sort of believe that this good storytelling is going to mandate this and there's no way they're not going to follow through, like, I am a little bit more inclined to want to at least entertain the idea that maybe it isn't going to all kind of work out as we would like to do, which is the fundamental question of queer baiting. Like, it is still, even though we'd like this to not be the case, it is still quite possible that they just won't ever make anything of any of this. And I guess we can't make the final determination of whether it's queer baiting until that happens. But I just kind of want to throw the question out there, like, is the fact that, I guess, are we possibly blind, particularly people in the kind of by Dean Destiel meta community, is that wanting to believe, making us a little bit manipulatable and naive about what's really going on here? Like, that's a very loaded way to put the question, but I do kind of want to ask the question at the very least.
I think it depends on how you see it. As I've stated earlier, I am a heterosexual woman who has no agenda. I just binge watched the show, absolutely loved the brothers dynamic. I would have absolutely loved it if they brought Cass in and that he was going to be a third brother and they would be brothers in arms, and it would have been a fantastic way to tell a story about love and family and togetherness and family don't end in blood, all those kinds of themes. And then they shoved a Destiel subtext in my face. To be honest, it was only because of his interactions with Cass that I then became more aware of Dean's behaviour towards other men. And then it was by delving into the meta community that I understand now, and obviously then I kind of watched it further forward and saw a ton of by Dean subtext. But that was how I kind of came into it. So I don't perceive that my own reading of the show is based on any kind of agenda or any kind of anything other than what the show has given me. The show has made me ship Destiel. The show has made me see Dean as bi, and I don't feel like I have any kind of agenda outside of that has made me do that. It's all come from the show, and then it was once I binge watched the whole show, I then came on Tumblr, and then I've now seen a lot of other things that have made it more obvious to me, but I saw it all long before I ever saw any kind of meta community at all.
I think, obviously, when I first watched the show, I'd never really thought much about the subtext or had any agenda whatsoever, trying to watch it like a general viewer, really. And it was only through, again, like Tink says, it was only really through watching it that I picked up on these things off my own back without really any knowledge or background, to say, oh, this is what I'm looking for. I wasn't, and at the time, I mean, to be honest, I can say I am bisexual, but I don't, it's something that I've kind of come to terms with quite recently, rather than knowing that, being confident with that before I watched Supernatural, and therefore looking for bisexual characters to relate to. I definitely wasn't doing that when I started watching the show. I like I said, I try to take an objective viewpoint when I watch the show. I always try to at first look for another explanation that counteracts any sort of by Dean or Destiel reading. I do this constantly because I don't want to get my own hopes up. And I don't want to get the hopes up of the people that come to my blog either and say, we desperately want Destiel to be canon. We desperately want Dean to be bi. I don't want to be saying to those people, oh, yes, it's definitely going to happen because I see it too. I always try to look at the show and think, right, well, where's the non-Destiel reading? Where's the contradiction here? Where's the no homo? Where's the out? I always look for those things, and a lot of the time I do find them, and I say, okay, there is an ambiguous reading here. Like I can say with Cass's love confession, for example, it is ambiguous, and I can say, yes, there is a platonic reading there. There is a reading that he meant it for everyone. Certainly subtextually, it's for Dean. It's a love confession for Dean, but the initial reading is going to be platonic. The reading the general audience are going to see is platonic. So I do see that. I think that the moment that they passed any sort of boundary was with the mixtape, and I've said this on my blog, and I've spoken to lots of meta writers about this. That mixtape, it's not ambiguous. I don't care how many people try to argue against it. The primary reading of a mixtape in cinema, it's a love trope, it's a romantic trope. It's the reading that any general audience member is initially going to look at that and they're going to say, oh, isn't that supposed to be romantic? And that is where, to me, you're having to, that's where it passes the boundary of the platonic reading versus the Destiel reading. And so I can say that throughout, yes, it might have always been in the background. There might have always been this structural love story being built up in the subtext with Destiel that sometimes, it didn't quite make sense without that reading. Like I said, in season 11, like Tink said as well, you get that. There are times in season 11 where really, if you're not looking for Destiel, the story doesn't really make sense. Yes, we can look past that, and a general audience are going to ignore that, and they're just going to be a bit like, huh, and then they'll move on. So I do constantly try and question the general audience's reading of this show and how it would come across to people that aren't in our community. I think the mixtape is on another, they've crossed the boundary. So basically, whereas I can always say up to that point, there is the platonic textual reading, and the Destiel, the Biden reading runs below that. The mixtape brought the Destiel reading to the forefront. It brought it ahead of the platonic reading, and it becomes the first and most obvious reading that you're looking. So when you're watching that episode, when you're watching that scene, the romantic reading is the one that is the most obvious, and the platonic reading you have to think about. Whereas usually it's the other way around, if that makes sense. So I would say up to that point, we could still say, yes, fine. They could have ended it without Destiel, without Biden, and it would be queerbaiting. I still consider it queerbaiting, but it wouldn't quite be an absolute travesty. It wouldn't be, I cannot believe they haven't done this, the pitchforks and torches going up to the writers. That's fine. I do think the mixtapes changed that.
That's interesting. Because obviously there's been a lot of discourse about the mixtape, understandably, but that's actually an interesting point to me, because I definitely agree that oftentimes, so there's actually like a formal academic term for there's the dominant reading and there's the subtextual reading, which is polysemy. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it was generated by an academic named John Fisk in an essay he published in the 1980s. And it's basically an argument that he makes about mainstream media, that mainstream media is designed to have more than one reading in it, precisely to cater to multiple groups of viewers at the same time. And so, and it's a very, very popular kind of established concept of media studies. And that idea of there's a dominant obvious reading, and then there are built-in subtexts usually for minority audiences, precisely to get a certain amount of, get something extra out of the text, but the text doesn't sort of commit itself to that. And it's interesting that you say that the mixtape is the moment when the dominant reading sort of ends up being that the queer sort of reading becomes the dominant reading in that moment, because I hadn't thought about it in that way exactly. But I actually think that arguably you're right, that the obvious reading and the most sort of dominant reading of a mixtape is as explicitly romantic gesture, and that actually you have to do more intellectual work to see the heterosexual reading of it or a platonic reading of it in that sense. And I hadn't made that very, very clear distinction before, and I actually don't know that there are any other moments in Supernatural where that's the case. That's a very compelling kind of argument. But to kind of a little bit get back to the issue, again, I'm one of those people who has a lot of ambivalence, because on the one hand, I want to be hopeful and I want to be kind of idealistic about all this, but I don't know how much. I guess this maybe is a good place to end, is like a lot of this requires a certain amount of, like, how much faith do we want to be putting in showrunners? You know, as much as we'd like to believe that, you know, they want to tell a good story and they want to make us happy as fans and they want to, like, finish the story out in a good way or whatever, this is all coming to us through a kind of money-making, you know, infrastructure, and there are all kinds of other forces happening here. And kind of, like, I want to just put the question out, like, how optimistic is it kind of naive to be optimistic? Is being optimistic about this enabling the manipulation that we fear about queerbaiting? Because that's the fear about queerbaiting, that it's a manipulation designed to get us to watch while we're never going to get the payoff that we want. So I'm just curious, like, what do people think about how being optimistic is itself part of what potentially enables that manipulation? Or is it just one of those things where it's like, you can't help being optimistic and you just kind of like end up feeling how you feel about it? I just kind of want to get people's takes on that. Like, is optimism allowing yourself to be manipulated, or do you think that it is earned at this point?
I think optimism based on subtext which is not that strong, optimism based on some lurks and potentially the subtext of seasons 6 and 7 and even 8, that could potentially be, you know, something that I can understand that people were optimistic at the time. I can definitely see the reading, but it's not something that I think is anywhere near half as strong as it is now. I think for me, the real turning point, as Sarah was saying, for her, the turning point was the mixtape. I totally agree that now for me, that was a really huge turning point. But for me, it was in season 11 and reading the story and noticing that the plot didn't make any sense without Destiel and therefore by Dean. Now, around the mixtape, we also had Dean breaking down the walls of the bunker with all the bisexual lights flashing everywhere. I mean, when I saw that, I think I jumped up and down and raced around my living room for about 10 minutes before I sat down and watched the rest of the episode, because I couldn't believe that the bisexual flag colours were flashing as he was firing that grenade launcher. That was just, I couldn't believe it. Broing down the metaphorical walls, which Tony then called the metaphorical walls. Yeah. And then we also had the deleted scene, which then had the bisexual flag on his laptop while he's talking about the nun story. I mean, it's everywhere now. It's not even really that subtextual anymore. I mean, obviously, yes, it's in the subtext, but it's like, it's so blatant that it's hardly subtextual. And then we have I love yous and canon mixtapes and all the stuff that's actually in the text. It just seems to me like it doesn't make any sense that it's not going in that direction. And of course, yes, Dad might leave and someone else might come in, or Dad might be, God forbid, he might be completely queerbaiting us and he might be not wanting to follow through on this story. I mean, who knows what's going on in his head? But it's kind of looking at it from the logical point of view now, that for me, logically, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm tentatively positive and optimistic, while still thinking that, of course, there might be someone high up at the CW who will just say no. There could be a different showrunner who comes in. There could be a whole bunch of things that happen that mean that it doesn't happen. So I'm not saying it's 100% going to happen ever, but it's just a sort of a logical optimism.
I think that's right, actually. I always used to say that I was cautiously optimistic, and it was And I did used to doubt myself a lot. And there is always the argument, as you say, that your own optimism is, they're using your own optimism as a manipulation to get you to continue watching. We want you to keep watching the show. We're going to keep putting these things in here because we know that if Dean and Cass have like 5 minutes of screen time together alone on screen, we know that Destiel shippers are going to go crazy and they're going to go and gif it like 100 times on Tumblr, and it's going to be this wonderful thing. So that 5 minutes of screen time is really valuable to us, even if we don't actually intend to take it anywhere. And I think that whilst that's still something that could be in play, I don't think that I'm being manipulated anymore. I don't think maybe I was at one point. Maybe at one point they could have been putting all these things in, and they were playing on our optimism. I think that they've lost so many people because of not following through, though, that I don't think that any manipulation on the part of the showrunners is intentional. I don't see that. I don't see it as something that they're actually thinking about. I think perhaps they are thinking, yeah, we need to get Dean and Cass together on screen for a couple of shots because that's going to be gold and the audience are going to eat it up. Like just the same way that they might have said, if we get Sam topless, that the audience are going to eat that up, like it's the same kind of, they might be having that sort of thought process. But I don't think that I still don't think that I don't think they consider it queerbaiting. I don't think that what they think they're doing is queerbaiting, and I don't feel like I'm being queerbaited anymore. And I do think that it's more of a what is logical at this point in time. That's generally my observation whenever I'm watching this show. I will always question what is the dominant reading here, as you said. Like I didn't know about that guy that you mentioned. That's very interesting. I wouldn't mind reading a bit more about that. But yeah, with the dominant reading, what is the dominant reading? How logical is my Destiel reading? How logical is my by Dean reading here? When it becomes a point of that I'm no longer being optimistic, I'm being logical, I think again it's a good argument to say at that point it goes beyond queerbaiting, and which is why I don't think they are at the moment. And why I think that they're building to a conclusion which will be in our favour.
It's also building it together with the rest of the story. For me, I see the story, and I know Sarah's the same, we see the story as a whole. So we don't just focus on Dean and Destiel, or even just Dean and Cass. We also focus on Sam, we focus on the story overall. And our reading, for example, of season 12, or for the whole show, our reading is that Dean is multifaceted and that he represses, he sublimates. Well, we got textual sublimation in season 12. Our reading was that Dean was Sam's mom, and we got textual Dean is Sam's mom in season 12. My reading early on of season 12 was that Mary was going to be the bad mother, and that it was through that Dean was going to emancipate himself and realize that he deserved better, and that's exactly what happened. And it's just kind of looking at it logically as a whole and seeing the Dean and the Destiel as a part of that. Why would the rest of the readings that the Meta community have, and that they have had long since before I started, why would all those readings be textualized now, and not two of the main huge ones that are the ones that have some of the most subtext?
Yeah, and like, believe me, like I feel that strong impulse to be optimistic, and I am very compelled by a lot of the arguments that I see in the sort of meta community about the future, and I'm not convinced that it won't happen. Like I said, I am extremely on the fence. I think there's a strong possibility that it could happen. I do also think there is the possibility that it won't happen. I'm not one of those people who's like 100% sure, and there are people who feel like sure to the core of their being that it's going to happen, and I'm not one of those people. But right now I would say I'm extremely cautiously optimistic, because I do agree that sometimes it gets to a point that's really super blatant, like the mixtape, for example, and I find myself thinking that it feels like, yes, that they are making gestures towards trying to bring the general audience in on this dynamic and sort of raise that idea to them. And it feels like they're maybe setting up those first like stepping stones there. Again, to me, it doesn't feel like it's far enough along that there's no way it's not going to happen. But I see the like moves to make it more and more explicit as time goes on. And so I'm still on the fence as of right now as to whether I think it ultimately will end up as a queer bait or not. I definitely think if the show ends and it doesn't happen, at the very least, Dean's bisexuality isn't canonized. And one thing we didn't even get into, and we don't really have time to, unfortunately, is the difference between queerbaiting a character's sexuality and queerbaiting a relationship. We've sort of been talking about them as if they're the same thing, or as if they're, utterly joined with each other, and they're not. But that may have to be a conversation for another day, just because it can't go on forever, unfortunately. It would be fun to, probably, but you can't.
I mean, the anger that would happen if, for example, Cass came back in a female body and Destiel was canon, I can never... That's kind of why the two are kind of interlinked, You just can't imagine that would ever be a possibility.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because that is a lurking fear that I've always had, that they're going to try to pull that at the very end as a way to try to, have Destiel, but, save Dean's heterosexuality at the same time, which, I don't think that's going to happen, but I live in fear that it might. But, I mean, like I said, we won't know for sure until the very, very end, obviously. But I did... Like I said, I'm just always very, very ambivalent about the tone to sort of approach this, because, I have also heard people say, and I kind of agree, that, community optimism, this is one thing that was very, very prevalent in the Sherlock fandom, is that the community's, collective optimism fed into that sensibility of, there's no way this isn't going to happen. And, there's always that possibility of the community sort of talking itself into this, and the idea of, the echo chamber, that the echo chamber just becomes so powerful that it takes on that life of its own and produces that kind of optimism that maybe isn't warranted. And I don't want to be we shouldn't entertain that idea, but I also, I'm always just trying to, be even-handed about, how optimistic we want to be, just to kind of mediate that impulse a little bit.
I try that a lot. I try to very much be, like I say, cautiously optimistic, and to, like I say, anything could change, canon could change. I also have done what Sarah's done. I've gone back and rewatched the series and tried really hard to stick to Dean is a dude bro heterosexual guy, Cass is his dude buddy. I've tried that so hard. I just always end up back here, and so on my blog, and I'll say it on this podcast, I do really believe that there is definitely a potential that neither could happen. There definitely is. It's not what I believe is the logical standpoint at this moment in time with the people that we have in charge and with what we have had so far. However, there is a huge amount of change that could happen. And there is utterly the possibility that it could be completely illogical as well. So there is definitely a potential that it might not happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with Tink there as well. And I think that I do agree with you that there is a level in fandom to, like you said about the echo chamber, where it is quite possible that the optimism comes from, bloggers feeding other bloggers, and everyone's talking. And certainly I know that meta writers have been accused of it before. They've been accused of sort of feeding that optimism, and then we tend to get blamed if something disappoints the fandom. And which is why so many meta writers do have to turn around and say, these are my own opinions, these are my own thoughts, don't take them as gospel, because there's still a very, very strong possibility that what we're saying is, not going to happen, just because we see all of these points. And I will say as well, you said about the difference between Dean and Destiel. I would always go for Dean before Destiel. If Destiel was to fall on the wayside, if they weren't bringing Cass back, so long as before the end of the season, Dean is out of that closet, I need him to be out of that closet. It's not, at this point in time, I think it's necessary. I think if he remains in the closet until the end of the show, then yes, it is 100% queerbaiting. We have been cheated out of that, because that has been built into the subtext for 12 seasons. Destiel is different. We meta about the ship a lot, and I know the mixtape is obviously that moment, and where, as to me, it's the dominant reading. Destiel is now romantic, but I would try to be careful, and I do agree that there is always the possibility that fandom can make itself more optimistic, and we do have to be careful there. And it can, I suppose, then which is why we have to try and look at things logically all the time, and always argue with ourselves and try to find counter arguments and try to see a dominant platonic reading in the script, try to see a dominant heterosexual reading for Dean. I will generally always try to argue with myself over those points before I shout about anything on my blog, because I don't want to rile up the fandom and make them start thinking, yes, it's going to happen, because we don't know that. Even if we think logically it makes sense at this point, it is the logical conclusion, we still don't know. And it still could go the way of queerbaiting, but we won't know those points until Endgame.
Yeah, that's always, I feel like, where the kind of conversation about queerbaiting, especially with a show that's still going on, like, it is still up in the air at this point. And so we can't really give a final verdict on this podcast, or it would be a little bit kind of like overstepping what we could reasonably say to try to give a verdict one way or the other at this point, I feel like. So does anyone have any other ideas just around this topic generally that you want to think through or talk about, or things that you wanted to say before that we just drove a little bit past? Any other final thoughts about this?
I think one of the things that I find interesting is with I'm going off the fact that I'm talking a lot about Dab era now, because Dab era is really the era that has really exponentially increased the by Dean and the Destiel reading, and the performing Dean and the Dean as Sam's mom, all the kind of stuff that has been in the subtext for 12 years and 9 years, has really been built on.
Codependency.
Yeah, the toxic bro. Oh, yeah, exactly. So all those things that he's really built on and really brought to the forefront, and by Dean is one of those. We now also have new writers, some of which are queer, and I think it would be really interesting to think about what they're writing, what they've previously written. Sarah and I have talked about this a lot. We've talked about it on our blogs, what they've previously written, what their aims are, and whether they would join a show which is known for queerbaiting if it was then going to be building this story in season 12, and then for it not to follow through. That just seems like a very strange thing to me. So I think it's really interesting to think about who's writing it, the author intent as well.
Yeah, and obviously queerbaiting is always an argument about author intent at the end of the day. So that's definitely going to be a useful practice. And we also just don't know how much longer the show is going to last. As people have said before, who's going to end up being on the writing staff, who's going to end up being the kind of showrunners when the show kind of ends. And so it is all very much still up in the air. But I do kind of agree with people who broadly say that this kind of Dab has been, I feel like, getting more heavily into making subtext text. You can see that in multiple things, as you all have sort of mentioned before, that has been a sort of pattern that's been happening recently. And it is nice to see those payoffs. And again, being very, 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 very cautiously optimistic that trend sort of continues with Dean and potentially with Destiel as well. Any other final thoughts, feelings, whatever?
Well, this kind of relates to what we've been saying about a lot of those things that were subtextual about Dean now being brought to the forefront. But I'm talking about him being queer-baited. I've always thought it makes a lot of sense for him specifically to not be out at the beginning of the series and to have to take time to become comfortable with himself and comfortable enough to actually come out and be openly bi. So I think that for the people who think that it's too late now or that it would have had to be at the beginning, I don't think that makes sense narratively for Dean.
Oh, I agree 100%. 100%. It's a beautiful coming out story. If the way they're going, it wouldn't have made sense to bring Dean out of the closet in seasons 1 to 5. His journey has been so, it's quite profound how he's built this character. He's got this facade. He's now shedding this facade, and there is so much. When you really delve into the psychology of Dean, there's a reason why he's such a popular character. And that coming out story, which I really do hope they follow through with, is part of his character. It is built into everything else. And I agree 100% that to me, it's such a fantastic message for so many people that for them not to do it, for them to actually be queerbaiting this character, I think that's a terrible thing for them to be doing, certainly at this point in the show, and it just doesn't logically seem like that's what they're doing. So yeah, I agree. Narratively, it wouldn't have made sense to have Dean come out right at the start. It makes sense for this to be part of his journey, that he's slowly shedding this facade, that he's becoming more comfortable with himself and who he is. And I do think bringing Mary back was a big part of that as well.
It's part of the overall facade of Dean. It's not just his sexuality, it's all the other aspects. It's him feeling that he deserves things for himself. It's feeling that he deserves loved. All those things that Mary brought up, all the things that we've seen in season 12, feeling like he can tell Sam that he loves Dory, feeling like he can tell Sam that, yeah, he does like chick flicks, that he actually will drink the cucumber water. I mean, that was a huge bone of contention. It was a joke, but it's so true. It's him saying to start with, I don't do that. And then turning around and saying, you know what, I do and I like it. It's part of his whole story. So we should, I hope now after 12/22 and seeing him breaking down those walls, which had the bi flag colour in the background, but that would be a part of his story now. It's the denouement. Hopefully that's what we should see. But it wasn't possible for that to happen before, because he hadn't got to that climax point where he had realised that and he was out the other side. Now, hopefully, he is, or we should see more of that. As a whole, with sexuality is just a part of it.
Yes, I agree as well. But for Dean as an individual character, it actually makes much, much, much more sense for him to come out sort of later on in his life and later on in the series. And I think that that's probably it. And it does, as you all were saying, it builds into a larger aspect of Dean's characterization about, deciding to be honest about how he really feels about all kinds of things, to not be so attached to a particular version of masculinity, all these different things that sort of come together in him sort of becoming comfortable with the idea of being queer. I definitely think it's very, very much an aspect of his core characterization, and I'm very invested in the idea of seeing it. Obviously, again, to just repeat one more time, we never really know what's going to happen, but that is one of the things that sort of I hope for it when I am optimistic, that I do sort of hope to see happen, because I think it would be the culmination of a lot of different kind of narrative trajectories for Dean, and I definitely just personally want to be able to see that happen. But we'll see if it actually comes to pass. Okay, I do think we need to kind of wrap it up for the day. Thank you so much, all of you, for just being fantastic guests. It's been really, really fantastic talking to all of you. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your insights and your thoughts and your your willingness to think about this in a deep way. It's been fantastic.
No, thank you very much as well. Thank you for inviting us.
And thank you to all of our listeners as well. We are still looking for more people to participate, so if you are interested in being on the podcast, or if you just want to send us some feedback, please get in touch with us either at our Tumblr, which is bydeanpodcast.tumblr.com, or via Gmail at bydeanpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much again, and we look forward to another conversation like this soon.